Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is a Ukraine war kind of peace negotiation update when they have these flurries of activity with regard to peace negotiations and proposed plans. I often have to do daily updates rather than include them in other videos because there's too much to talk about. So we are thinking about the 28-point peace plan that the Americans and Russians have proposed and put forward to the Ukrainians. This plan is seen by many as controversial. Some others are claiming it's a starting point, and actually there are some elements that aren't as bad as you might think. But the reactions from Europe and some Ukrainians have been pretty critical. Okay, let's get into it. Before we do so, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. It makes a difference, so thank you very much. Okay, let's get on. So we are going to start with the claim here from the Financial Times that the US expects Zelenskyy to sign the peace agreement by November the 27th. That's Thanksgiving. That is a mere 6 days away. So they've got a week to sign it, as according to this source. After that, the deal would be presented to Russia, with the process expected to finish by early December. I wonder whether you might start seeing a flurry of activity, but not on the diplomatic front, on the military front, by both sides, if they feel that there is this pressure to get a deal signed. Russia would want to have control of as much land as possible, although the understanding from the document is that they get that land anyway. So you might actually get the Russians maybe sitting back a little because, hey, we don't need to fight for this land because the Americans have given us all of Donbass anyway. But you might get the Ukrainians hitting Russia as hard as possible in terms of drones and missiles. The problem with that kind of approach is I think the Ukrainians are going to be operating at 100% anyway. There's no reason for them to be sitting back and under manufacturing and under sending the drones and missiles on a nightly basis. So that is a theory I've thrown up there and then immediately discounted. So there you go. Right. The White House has said that Trump is frustrated with both Russia and Ukraine for refusing to strike a peace deal. Now, this is Caroline Levitt, who is repeating the tired old both sidesism approach to the Ukraine war by saying, hey, Trump's really frustrated with both sides. You know, they're just not wanting to sign a peace deal. Hang on. Ukraine have actually worked their butts off to be very open to peace deals and have said, look, we're open to having a ceasefire. We've been saying that for months and months and months, ever since Donald Trump suggested that this was the way forward. And then Trump spoke to Putin at Alaska and was convinced that actually a ceasefire wasn't on. But, you know, you've asked us to jump through hoops and we've jumped through hoops. We've signed minerals deals. We've done this. We've done that. We've been open to this. Just been to Turkey, to Ankara, to speak to Erdogan, to talk about peace. So don't claim that this is both sides. And yet Caroline Levitt has to do that because they feel they cannot put the onus on Russia alone, that they cannot overtly criticize Russia without criticizing Ukraine. So as soon as they say something negative about Russia, they have to both sides it. Oh, Russia just aren't being quick enough to come to the table, but neither is Ukraine, of course. Ukraine's just as bad as Russia. No, that's not the case. So frustrating. So Envoy Steve Witkoff and Secretary of State Marco Rubio have quietly worked on a plan. Trump fully backs this plan, calling it good for both Russia and Ukraine. Good for Ukraine, says Nell Reports. I'm lost for words. And that's what we're going to talk about. Okay, so the U.S. Embassy Chief Julie Davis, that's not Julia Davis from Russian media monitors, this is Julie Davis at the U.S. Embassy, says peace talks between Ukraine and Russia are moving at an, quote, aggressive pace, calling it one of the most intense diplomatic pushes she's seen in 30 years. In reality, this aggressive pace looks a lot more like extortion and a sellout. Again, says Nell Reports. He's very critical of these peace negotiation points. Now, Axios has come out with a piece. Zelenskyy agrees to negotiate on Trump's peace plan for Ukraine. David Colin Demarest and Dave Lawler. Again, some of these people have been reporting very busily at the moment on this. Zelenskyy has told U.S. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll that he's willing to work with the Trump administration on its new plan for peace in Ukraine. Zelensky's office said he expects to discuss it with Trump soon. Zelenskyy and Driscoll, quote, agreed on an aggressive timeline for signature. Now, this could be Diplo speak for Zelenskyy really, I don't know, it's probably unfair to say stringing the Americans along. He is going to want to be seen to be fine with talking negotiations, with looking at this peace plan, not rejecting it out of hand, like straight away, as many others are doing. He needs to tread a very careful line between wanting the best for Ukraine and keeping the US on side. And he could be saying, "Yeah, I'm up for an aggressive timeline. We're going to look at this. We're going to be aggressively talking about this, seeking a positive outcome, but at the same time, understanding deep down that most of these points are impossible for Ukraine." Driscoll's delegation originally planned to travel to Ukraine to discuss military technology and strategy before the White House asked him to help kickstart negotiations with Zelenskyy on behalf of Witkoff and Rubio. So that's interesting. So their original remit was actually different. Now, Zelenskyy has said today during a meeting with the US Secretary of the Army, we talked about options for achieving real peace, the stages of work and formats for dialogue. Our teams will work on the points of the plan to end the war. We are ready for constructive, honest and operational work. Separately, I informed about Russia's terrible strike on Ternopil, Kh-101 missiles containing 175 foreign components that still get to Russia bypassing sanctions. I gave Secretary specific materials with information about companies that produce critical components. Could be useful. It'd be nice if the US whacked a load of sanctions on those. Peace is needed, and we appreciate the efforts of Trump and his team to return security to Europe. Ukraine defends life and independence thanks to courage of our people, our unity within the state, and the help of partners. We are working to ensure that all three elements are strong enough. Interesting. I think that's a reference to the corruption scandal, unity within the state, working on keeping that strong. So that is what Zelenskyy has said. Now, here, No Reports does a synopsis of the 28-point US peace plan that has been reportedly backed by Trump, published by MP Honcharenko. So Honcharenko is quite a critical MP in the Verkhovna Rada. He's a little bit controversial, but he has pulled out the 28 points, apparently got hold of them and put them on this document, although I haven't got Google Translate to hand. This thread outlines the key points, though, so we're just going to go over the 28 key points as far as No Reports understands it. What's clear is that the so-called Witkoff plan heavily favors Russia while offering little to nothing for Ukraine. So not too much difference from position yesterday, other than we got some more meat on the bone, it seems, a bit more detail. So and also we're getting reactions from Zelenskyy and from other people having had access to the peace plan, of course. Now, Ukraine's sovereignty is confirmed, but Kyiv must constitutionally renounce NATO membership. That's going to be a tough one. NATO agrees never to admit Ukraine and not to expand further. I mean, wow, this is straight away a dictation to NATO here from Russia. Ukraine's military is capped at 600,000. So that is 2.5 times capping, it appears. But there may be ways around that. And, reserves I don't think are included in that. So that's not maybe as bad as people think. We'll look at that in a wee while. European jets will be based in Poland, but NATO troops won't be in Ukraine. A non-aggression pact will be signed by Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. Past territorial disputes are declared resolved. It's all okay then. It's all resolved. Russia commits not to invade neighbors, just like they committed not to invade Ukraine, right? So, well, we're not going to do that. We're not going to, oh, we've done that. Oh, who knew? A US-led NATO-Russia dialogue begins to reduce global tensions and foster long-term economic cooperation. See where this is going. So economic cooperation between the US and Russia. The US gives Ukraine security guarantees. So this is possibly one of the most important points. One of the most positive points for Ukraine, I should say. The US gives Ukraine security guarantees, void if Ukraine strikes Moscow or invades Russia. So security guarantees for you, but you got to be careful because then it will be voided. If Russia invades, a coordinated military response and full sanctions return. Okay, so then that is a strong security guarantee. Elections in Ukraine must be held within 100 days. Wow. EU membership is allowed with temporary market access. Well, thank you very much for allowing Ukraine to do what it, you know, we respect its sovereignty, but and we'll let you do this. Of course you let us do this. We're a bloody democratic nation. You can't stop us from doing that. How unreal. A $200 billion Ukraine reconstruction plan is launched using frozen Russian assets. The US, now this is outrageous, and I do need to check this, but if this is the case, then I am flabbergasted. This is a staggering element to this proposal. The US gets 50% of the profits. Europe adds another $100 billion. A new US-Russia fund will launch joint economic projects, and Russia gets phased reintegration into the global economy and a G8 return invite. This makes me feel a little bit sick. A US-Russia security task force will oversee the deal. Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant operates under IAEA oversight. Power is split 50-50. Ukraine agrees to remain nuclear free. Both countries adopt education reforms to fight racism, protect minorities, and ban Nazi ideology. Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk are recognized de facto as Russian, also by the US. Kherson and Zaporizhzhia are frozen at current front lines. Ukraine withdraws from parts of Donetsk, forming a natural buffer zone under international recognition. Russia cannot place troops here. Future territorial changes must be peaceful. Ceasefire begins once both sides withdraw to agreed positions. Dnipro River trade and Black Sea grain exports will continue. All POWs and civilians, including deported children, must be returned. A full wartime amnesty is granted. The agreement is legally binding, overseen by a Peace Council chaired by Donald J. Trump. Sanctions will snap back if violated. So there are elements of that, particularly, at the end there, with obviously the return of POWs and deported children and whatnot. Though that's all, good and as it should be, but there are elements of this that I can't see Ukraine ever agreeing to. So the leaked 28-point peace plan would require Ukraine to recognize de facto Russian control over Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk regions while freezing Zaporizhzhia and Kherson along contact lines. That is one of the main elements there. But here's a problem. Russia would receive full amnesty for all war actions and sanctions relief negotiated in stages. The US would take 50% of profits from frozen Russian assets used for Ukraine's reconstruction, with Russia invited back to the G8. If I was Europe, I would be telling the US to get effed. How do you get 50% of the profits when Europe has now given more to Ukraine than the US has? Why? That is absolutely outrageous. If I was Europe, I'd say this is a non-starter. This cannot happen. That needs to be renegotiated. Now, of course, the idea is that this is a starting point and you would negotiate all of these points. The Trump peace plan for Ukraine includes NATO-style guarantee, according to Axios. Now, I think that could be one of the most important points, because I think the security guarantee is the key for anything happening. Ukraine are never going to have a peace, and I think finally the US has seen this, understood this, recognized this. They're never going to go into any kind of ceasefire arrangement or peace negotiations or peace deal without a solid security guarantee, because that's what stops Russia taking a second bite of the apple. Zoom in. So it states that the peace plan, any future significant, deliberate, and sustained armed attack by Russia on Ukraine, quote, shall be regarded as an attack threatening the peace and security of the transatlantic community, and the US and its allies will respond accordingly, including through military force. So this is a NATO Article 5 equivalent without it being NATO. The document includes lines for signatures from Ukraine, the US, the EU, NATO, and Russia. Senior White House official said Russia was briefed on the draft, but it's unclear if Putin's signature will ultimately be required. The security guarantee would be for an initial 10 years and could be renewed by mutual consent. A senior White House official and another source with direct knowledge confirmed the document's legitimacy. Senior officials said the proposal will have to be discussed with European partners and could still change. I mean, I'd imagine so. The official said that the Trump administration views the proposed security guarantee as a big win for Zelenskyy and for Ukraine's long-term security. Yeah, it's a big win, but this was the bare minimum of, that the security guarantee should be the starting point. Like, you can't have a peace deal without the security guarantee. So the idea that, look, we've got you, and I wonder whether this is the US's and by extension Russia's ability to then get what it wants in other areas. So Russia is able to get its territorial gains. It's being let off war crimes, of which there are hundreds of thousands, right? It gets let off all of that because of the security guarantees. So the idea here is this is a big win for Zelenskyy. Look, you got your security guarantee now. Yeah, that's the bare minimum. But because you've claimed that this is the big win, the security guarantee, you're just giving Russia everything else. You get everything you want because, hey, you got a security guarantee now. Russia gets everything they want. So the friction point, Zelenskyy now has a proposal in his possession that would require him to cede even more Ukrainian territory than Russia currently controls, and see Russia welcomed back into the community of nations with sanctions lifted and amnesty for war crimes. But it would give him a stronger guarantee against further Russian aggression than previously seen likely while Trump was in the White House. It's ridiculous. Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, who has taken the lead in drafting the 28-point plan, discussed the proposed security guarantee with Zelensky's national security advisor, Rustem Umerov, over the weekend, and it was shared in writing with Zelenskyy on Thursday. The US official said the plan could open Trump up to backlash with the America First allies, as it would effectively commit the US military to defending Ukraine in the event of another war. Anyway, lots more to read on that, but I think that's the main point there. Now, as Elliot Higgins points out here, point number 26 is totally controversial. Point 26, all parties involved in the conflict will receive full amnesty for their actions during the war and agree not to make any claims or consider any complaints in the future. So Higgins says all the rape, torture, and murder will be brushed under the carpet, a great lesson for any future war criminals. How can this be acceptable? Some truly horrific things have taken place. People are painstakingly collecting evidence for international criminal courts for this. And then suddenly, all that work you've done, all those interviews you've done with people who have been raped, who've had their family members murdered before your very eyes, this and that, and torture, all that torture you've been experienced. By the way, we've let the Russians off. The Russians are completely off the hook now. Completely off the hook. Don't worry about it. It's part of the peace negotiations. I think that is horrendous. It's horrendous. Now, Mark Galliotti here, who, yeah, sometimes I really like a lot of his analysis, and other times I'm like, Here he says, I'm sure this will be an unpopular opinion, but while the text of the US plan for Ukraine is poorly drafted and incomplete, it's still not a simple call for Ukrainian capitulation. As a starting point for something that could stop the killing, it has some promise. A few thoughts. So he says, by sticking to acknowledging Russia's de facto control of the occupied territories, it sidesteps the need for Ukrainian constitutional referendum or even EU formal acceptance. This doesn't preclude some peaceful future reunification, Germany style. Okay. Capping the Ukrainian army to 600,000 isn't as draconian as I imagine the Russians wanted. When I talked to some British MOD analysts a couple of months back, they expressed doubts Kyiv could afford more than 500,000 on a long-term basis. And that's also just the standing army, to which there would presumably be a substantial mobilization reserve in case of war. As many as Ukraine might like, probably not, but the country would be by no means defenseless. There continue to be claims that Ukraine would be denied long-range weapons. I'm not seeing that. Am I just reading an incomplete version of the text? I'm not seeing that in the text, just a commitment to not actually striking Moscow or St. Petersburg without cause, quote, without cause. Withdrawal from the rest of Donetsk region continues to be a tough one, making this a DMZ or DMZ, demilitarized zone, may make it easier to swallow as it addresses the issue of the region being used as a springboard for future attacks. Sanctions relief is staged, likely not complete, and Moscow must allow 100 billion of its frozen funds to go to Ukraine reconstruction. That's better than I imagined, even though the form of reconstruction looks like exploitative and colonial to the US gain. That's, I think, honestly, one of the biggest sticking points to this is the US is making them sign this deal and they get 50% of the reconstruction profits or monies. I'm not 100% sure. I'm certainly not saying this is a good plan. There are some weird anomalies. Start one. I don't know if that's anything to do with the nuclear proliferation, and whole legions of devils in the details, from monitoring to security guarantees. But arguably, it's closest to the basis for talks that we could have expected. Now, I'm just going to read you a couple of responses to this. Vladimir Putin nemesis says Ukraine needs to join a security grouping like NATO or have bristling capabilities and substantial support like Israel. I accept the latter is more likely. However, this deal fails on the simple point that Russia lost this war on day one, and Russians need to see that and regret it. There doesn't seem to be any kind of concession for Russia here. There's no concessions for Russia, and Russia don't get any punishment. This is essentially just allowing the aggressor to go in and steal territory from sovereign nations. There is no comeuppance for Russia. John Jackson says, I respectfully disagree with Mark Gagliardi. It's a provocation, an insult, and intended as such is not a serious document. Russia is the aggressor. Its army should be reduced, even considering that for Ukraine is propaganda that Ukraine was ever a threat to Russia. Odd you don't see that. Someone else says, it's a call for capitulation. It calls for Ukraine never joining NATO, for Ukraine holding elections in 100 days. Only a capitulated country can accept such things. It also makes the US a profiteer and returns frozen assets to Moscow. It also removes sanctions, which basically shouldn't happen. Yeah, so it is controversial. Now, US envoy to the UN, Mike Waltz, remember he used to be the National Security Advisor, warned that new sanctions could hit Russia if it continues to ignore calls for peace. He said Washington offered generous terms, including sanctions relief, and urged Russia to engage with Ukraine. No reports, again, incredulous. Generous terms, you mean almost everything Russia wants. I think I'm agreeing a lot with no reports at the moment. Steve Rosenberg, looking at the Russian newspapers, says no signs of compromise in Moscow. Today, one Russian newspaper states, quote, Putin is ready for talks on Ukraine on Russia's terms. Another paper points out, quote, after the Alaska summit, from our side, there were no goodwill gestures, just an intensification of attacks. This is a really important point. I don't know if this is the point the Russian was making here, but since Trump has taken over, all we have seen from Russia is an intensification of attacks. Like, the involvement of the US has essentially, other than, I think the sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, other than that, Trump has just essentially overseen massive increases in Russian efforts in the war. Now, the Ukrainian representative to the UN Security Council has said there will never be any recognition, formal or otherwise, of Ukrainian territory temporarily occupied by Russia or as Russian. Our land is not for sale. Ukraine will not accept any limits on its right to self-defense or on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. We will not reward the genocidal intent that underpins Russian aggression by undermining our identity, including our language. Peace requires strengthened security and sustained financial assistance to Ukraine, and the Kremlin regime will not stop unless it is stopped through unyielding and concerted pressure. There is only one realistic path to ending this war. Russia must be compelled to retreat, economically, politically, militarily. So this is really strong rhetoric from Ukraine that essentially, if this is to be taken seriously, completely undermines the 28-point peace plan. This is a rejection of the peace plan in the UN by Ukraine. Now, whether their messaging in the UN Security Council ends up being just essentially undermined or completely different from what they're doing in terms of negotiations with Russia and the US, I don't know. So it could be that they have to say stuff like this, but actually they'll end up conceding on some of these points. I don't know. But Europe, this is according to, is it Politico? Europe to Trump, your Ukraine peace plan is no plan at all. US envoy Steve Witkoff's ceasefire blueprint is a blow to dismayed Europeans who thought Trump finally understood that you can't trust Putin. European and Ukrainian officials reject Trump's 28-point proposal, calling it one-sided and tailored to satisfy Putin. The plan demands Ukraine give up territory, slash its military, and welcome Russia back into global institutions, all while European allies were shut out of the drafting process. I mean, the point that both Ukraine and Europe didn't even feature in these negotiations, and that they appear to be maximalist Russian demands, apart from the security guarantees. I mean, the security guarantees is the only carrot here that's really worth anything to Ukraine. Everything else is just Russian demands being realized. So, yeah, new peace plan is just a list of, quote, items to please Putin. It's a very bad plan, said Politico, citing a senior European official. The Europeans have realized that their efforts to grab a seat at the negotiating table by agreeing to pay for military aid to Ukraine seem to be yielding no results. Yeah. And it's interesting when you have Republican big hitters like Newt Gingrich. Remember him? My goodness. Important to remember, says Tim White, for all the stupidity at the top of the US political tree, there's still a huge groundswell of support for Ukraine. Even those with no love for Ukraine realize the danger posed by Putin. It was nice to see Republican former Speaker, 82-year-old Newt Gingrich, post this. He said, any peace, scare quotes peace, any scare quotes peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia, which weakens Ukraine's ability to defend itself, is in fact a surrender agreement, which guarantees that in the next few years, Putin will overrun all of Ukraine. Ukrainian courage and patriotism should not be destroyed by Americans growing tired of stopping evil. A Putin victory will be a stepping stone to a much, much more dangerous world. Yes, spot on. Newt Gingrich is right. Steve Witkoff is not right. Now, interesting that this comes out. So Defence Secretary John Healey, UK Defence Secretary, I've got a lot of time for him. I think he's excellent. Said reconnaissance trips over the summer helped finalise which troops, which roles and HQ locations would be used during peace. So the UK has picked the military units it could send to Ukraine as part of the coalition of the willing. Of course, this goes directly against one of the points of the 28-point peace plan, where you're going to have no NATO forces inside Ukraine. And UK is going, we know exactly who we're going to send, and we know where we're going to send it. Thank you very much. So anyway, lots of information coming out about this. You know, there's an explainer in the Guardian, as there will be in every sort of newspaper, would have thought today. Plan, let's just have a look a little bit. Plan reportedly drafted by Russian and US officials, including the influential head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund, Kirill Dmitriev, who has been involved in previous talks on Ukraine and is known to be in touch with the US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. Witkoff and the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio have been quietly working on a plan with both Russia and Ukraine for around a month, said Caroline Levitt. Now, I don't know how much Ukrainian interaction there has been for this, and how much they contributed to it, because quite frankly, it just looks like a massively maximalist document for Russia. She rejected concerns that the plan echoes many of Moscow's maximalist demands. We've talked about the territory, and I think that could be a real sticking point, and the nuclear power plant. So security guarantees that I think is going to be the big sort of positive for Ukraine, but that's not a concession. That's just security guarantee is a mechanic to stop further war. It's not any concession about what goes on with regard to the war that's already taken place and how it gets resolved. It's how it stops it happening again. So the idea that this, like I said earlier, but I'm saying it in a different way now, the idea that this is a gain for Ukraine, that this is, well, you get security guarantees and they get Donbass and they get half of Kherson and half of Zaporizhia and half of the nuclear power plant, but you get security guarantees. That's not a thing. That's not a positive. That's a mechanism to stop the war continuing. Like, what do we get? What concessions does Russia have to commit to? None. And they get all of their slates wiped clean. It's absolutely ridiculous. Yes, so in addition, $100 billion in frozen Russian assets would be dedicated to rebuilding Ukraine, but others would be invested in a separate US-Russian investment fund, quote, aimed at strengthening relations and increasing common interest to create a strong incentive not to return to conflict. Bollocks. But, you know, the idea there is that, you know, that's nothing to do with Ukraine. That is Others would be invested. Some money to do with this war, frozen Russian assets would be invested in a separate US Russian investment fund. Why is it not why is it not a Polish Russian investment fund? Why is it not a Swedish Russian investment fund? The bullies are just coming around trying to make there be peace and extort money. It's absolutely outrageous. Anyway, yeah, it makes me super angry. But yeah, there are these kind of there's this messaging that Ukraine is aggressively moving on this, is involved in diplomacy, is you know moving in the right direction and working with the Trump administration. And I don't know, like I said, that is them saying what they have to say, but in reality, they can't sign up to any of these points or many of these points. So I don't know where it goes from here, but what I want is really strong European repudiation, and that seems to be happening. It has to involve. You can't draft these proposals without the involvement of Europe and Ukraine. You just can't. I'm sorry, Trump, you can't. We'll see. Anyway, that's enough from me. That's just a little bit more meat on the bone for you regarding these peace negotiations. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.